Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Uday Bhaskar. Before I introduce my guests, a word about Security Scan. This program seeks to provide an informed and objective perspective on security developments relevant to India, as also those security issues that have a salience both regionally and globally. This week, the spotlight is on the Uri terror attack, and we review the global response to the challenge of terrorism, as also look at the South Asian experience and state-sponsored terrorism in particular. How do different nations perceive terrorism and what locus does it have in their national policies? To discuss this, we have three eminent guests: Ambassador TCA Raghavan, till recently the Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan, Manu to friends; Professor Christine Fair of the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., who is a noted scholar on Pakistan and terrorism; and Dr. Jabin Jacob of the Institute of Chinese Studies, an astute China watcher. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Raghavan. The question post-Uri in India that everyone is asking: why is Pakistan so invested in terror over the last 25-30 years? More so when it has gone through its own internal trauma. The most vivid is what happened in Peshawar when the school children were killed, particularly the children of the armed forces personnel, by the same terrorist groups that have been supported by Pakistan. So how would you characterize the Pakistani attitude or response to terrorism?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to your show. To my mind, the answer is very simple. Since the 1980s, a national security mindset has matured and crystallized in Pakistan, which feels that terrorist groups, ideologically motivated militias, can be used to achieve foreign policy and security policy objectives. To an extent, this national security mindset achieved a big success in the 1980s in Afghanistan, and this convinced it that this model of Afghanistan can be used as a template against India. Along with this has been a 70-year-long obsession for parity with India, and this national security mindset therefore uses terrorist groups as an instrument of state policy to try to see whether that objective of parity can be achieved. Now, clearly, parity is not an achievable objective, because since the early 1990s, the paths which India and Pakistan have taken have diverged very widely. Nevertheless, the idea of parity remains uppermost in this national security mindset. And therefore, you will continue to see these kind of terrorist attacks. And Uday is only the most recent in a whole series of attacks which have taken place in the 1990s, even earlier, and certainly in this century.
And some experts seem to suggest that it's neither the first nor the last. But I'll come to that in a moment. Professor Fair, if I could ask you, now that Ambassador Raghavan has outlined what he thinks is the Pakistani approach, you worked on Pakistan, you know that country. How would you characterize the Pakistani, as I said, attitude or response to terror? And we'll come to the United States shortly.
So I actually agree with you, but I would actually take your argument even further. In my book, I reviewed their military literature, really shuru se. And what was actually very apparent was that from the 1950s, Pakistan had realized, partly through their working with the United States, that in fact insurgency was a tool that they could actually use. The irony is we were training the Pakistanis so that they would be partners in counterinsurgency, and what they were learning was how they could actually run an insurgency on their own. And I think it's important to know that Pakistan learned that this worked actually in 1947. I think it's perhaps not known well enough, but we know from the work of Shuja Nawaz that those tribal marauders were in fact state supported. So this has actually
been the so-called irregulars.
The so-called irregulars, but they actually enjoyed not only the provincial support of what was then the Northwest Frontier Province and the Punjab Province, but ultimately it also enjoyed the support of Jinnah and of course the army. So this has actually been an evolving strategy. It's not even a tactic for them. And what I think has emboldened them, and we now know from the work of Feroz Khan that Pakistan had a crude nuclear device as early as 1984, possibly earlier. What we see with their nuclearization is that their brazenness to conduct these attacks far outside of Kashmir increased. So by the time we get to 1990, they're running an insurgency in Afghanistan, the Punjab, and also Kashmir, despite being the most isolated and under sanction that Pakistan had ever been.
But just hold that thought, Chris, if I want to come back to you on this question about what did Pakistan really imbibe from its interaction with the United States. You spoke about the 1950s and counterinsurgency, but I'll pick up the nuclear strand. Jabin, one of the things that's often said about Pakistan is the fact that it uses its nuclear weapons. Professor Fair is suggesting that they acquired them in the mid-1980s. But what we know from the Indian experience is that once Pakistan had acquired the nuclear capability in a covert manner, it, in a way, was using it as a shield to create greater space for terrorism against India. And the real sort of critical point is that China had enabled Pakistan in terms of acquiring nuclear weapons. So the question today is, how does China look at terrorism, which is not affecting it directly?
Well, there are two major points that the Chinese consider. One is, of course, their domestic aspect of the instability in Xinjiang, which they think that the Pakistanis can help them in at least keeping a tab on, or at least keeping it under control. The other is the overwhelming Chinese desire to stymie the United States in its near neighborhood. To both ends, Pakistan is a crucial actor. And, as a subset, the fact that the Chinese are supporting talks with the Taliban, talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban is actually, they do not have anybody else to trust but the Pakistanis. Unlike the North Koreans, the Pakistanis in their neighborhood are extremely influential, are extremely capable. So, there's nobody else that the Chinese can trust.
But Jabin, what if I were to suggest that apart from stymieing the United States, which you are suggesting is one of the drivers, would it be fair to say that for China, India is also an important driver in terms of the investment in Pakistan? I would make the case that after the creation of Bangladesh, that China started looking at India and South Asia in a far more focused way and looked at the nuclear option as one way of, shall we say, keeping India in a relatively neutral equilibrium as far as the region is concerned.
Well, that's certainly the case. But I think over time, the Chinese position on South Asia has also evolved. If you look at it, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor actually complicates China's relationship with Pakistan. Until now, it was an elite-to-elite, political and military elite-driven relationship.
I hope Beijing is tuning into what you're saying, that it's going to complicate. But I'll come back to that. Chris,
sure.
I want to come back and pick up this point from what Jabin was suggesting, that China's investment in Pakistan is in the fond hope that Pakistan will help them to deal with their domestic terrorism challenges. Isn't it very similar to what the United States thought it was doing soon after 9/11?
So I think there's a big difference. What China's doing with CPEC, and I'm actually a CPEC pessimist. I think for so many reasons, China's...
CPEC as in Sino-Pak, China-Pakistan.
Yeah, the CPEC, as in like the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
Okay.
I actually call it colonizing Pakistan to enrich China. China's execution rate is actually quite low over the last decade. It's only been about 6%. So, and there's a lot of opacity about what this thing is. So I'm actually quite skeptical. But the goal of CPEC, or the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is to actually make Pakistan dependent upon China. The United States never had that intention. And so there are many security elites in Pakistan who themselves fear that if Pakistan were to be so dependent and integrated, for example, the power grid, the ground lines of communication, that China will actually be in a position to place demands upon China in a way in which the Americans never did. And this raises interesting questions about terrorism. China has no interest in containing Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jamaat al-Dawa. But the Deobandi groups like Jaish-ul-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, these are all groups that interact with Al-Qaeda and, of course, ETIM, the Uyghur militancy.
Yeah.
So many Pakistani security elites fear that if they become so fully dependent upon China, that China will actually restrain them. And this points to a lot of ambivalence that the Americans have towards China. We're exhausted with the region. We're actually hoping that China will pick up more of the slack in Afghanistan. Afghanistan needs a railway. There's no other country so indifferent to to labor conditions of its own workers than China. And so even as China is a competitor in the Asia Pacific, we see it more as a potential collaborator or even a provider of security in South Asia. So the American view on the Chinese-Pakistan, Chinese-Afghan relationship is really quite different than how we view, say, China's behavior in the South China Sea.
You want to say something, Jabin?
Yeah, I mean, I would just back up those points that Professor Faya just made with the two additional points. One, and maybe take it a little further. One, the Chinese are actually reluctant to get into Afghanistan whole hog. The Afghans have been asking for a direct connection with the Chinese One Belt, One Road. The Chinese are sort of taking it easy there, saying security, stability, and so on. The other thing is, on the CPEC, there is a fair amount of dissension within Chinese ranks. It's about the feasibility of the CPEC. And that's where the problem lies. Chinese state-owned enterprises are extremely reluctant, extremely wary about the feasibility of the whole process. Okay. And if you have this now tension within the Pakistan side and tension within the Chinese side, then I think it only allows greater freedom for these non-state actors to actually play fast and loose.
Manu, can I come back to you on the China-Pakistan relationship? You're more than familiar with this to say that in India, there is a strongly held view about the Chinese investment in Pakistan and the fact that China turns a blind eye to Pakistan's terror profile. We saw this most recently in the United Nations. So what is your assessment? Why is China investing in Pakistan despite Pakistan's, as I said, role in terror?
Well, Chinese support for Pakistan is not new. This is something which has been there from the 1960s. And certainly, I would agree that in the last decade and a half, the quality of that relationship has changed. From largely a military-driven relationship, it has become now a more economic and political relationship. But what drives it are a number of factors. First, of course, is the strategic factor in which Chinese perceptions of the United States, Chinese perceptions of India have a role. But there are other factors also. And one factor which I would not underestimate is very deep Chinese concern about internal stability in Pakistan. And certainly these concerns have intensified in the last 2 or 3 years, and these were demonstrated very, very dramatically and visibly when the visit of the Chinese president to Pakistan had to be postponed because of a political agitation in the heart of Islamabad. To my mind, the Chinese saw this as a sign of how quickly Pakistan was descending into chaos, into greater instability. And they see it as an immediate neighbor with a large Islamic population, and they see it as part of their long-term interest to try to develop its infrastructure. So Chinese approaches to Pakistan are a combination of various factors. Partly it is strategic, partly it is tactical, but partly it is driven by having a very unstable, very large country close to its own Islamic belt, and therefore something has to be done to make sure that this contagion doesn't spread north into China too.
But on this, and I want to really ask all of you to perhaps ponder over this, if there is a pattern in China's investment in its own periphery, Manu speaks about China, Pakistan and the anxiety that it should not slip into greater disorder. But say to the outsider, the analyst, China has supported Pakistan acquiring nuclear weapons and missiles. Now the parallel is with North Korea, where again China has enabled North Korea's WMD profile, and there seems to be a certain anxiety about North Korea's ability to maintain stability as far as the domestic situation is concerned. Chris, how would you look at China's, how would you interpret Chinese strategy, even if it isn't your primary interest?
So, I sort of see it like this. If you actually look at China's history towards Pakistan, and of course the ambassador mentioned this himself, we've actually seen a retrenchment. So in the early 90s, China pulls back its support for Pakistan's position on Kashmir. In Kargil, China's position was the same as the Americans, as the Indians, as EU. And so if we actually look at its support during the wars, in 65 it gave a little bit of diplomatic support, but for the rest of the wars it gave zero support. It wasn't even willing, after Kissinger explicitly asked China to move some forces around to intimidate India. China had no interest in this. So my view of this is that China, actually I'm going to use the quote from Zia, he wants to keep this relationship at a boil. He doesn't want it to boil over. So China seeks to embolden Pakistan to constantly challenge India. But what China doesn't want to happen is there to actually be a conflict, and then that exposes their cards that they have no intention of doing anything. And so I think that's where you can begin to see that China has a different view of these different militant groups. So LET, for example, or Jamaat al-Dawa, or FIF, whatever we're going to call it these days, this is still a group that kills at the ISI's leash, just like the Haqqani network. The other groups that are less under the ISI's leash are a greater concern to China. So when I see it this way, if I were an Indian or in the Indian government, I would try to exploit the differences that China would have between, say, Jaish and Jamaat al-Dawa, and to really put pressure on China to sort of make those distinctions. Because when Pakistan sees China making those distinctions, that's a more powerful signal than something that Washington or Delhi could give.
I'm going to come back to this, Jabin, but from a slightly different angle. The United States went to war against Iraq in 2003 because they believed that it was a deviant regime that had acquired nuclear weapons and was supporting terror. Now, as far as China is concerned, you are a China watcher. China, Pakistan, China, North Korea. In both cases, the parallels or the similarities are the WMD profile, support from China, and the fact that both these nations are seen to be supporting terror by different constituencies. In East Asia, there is anxiety about North Korea's role. Here in South Asia and globally, Pakistan's contribution to terror is well acknowledged. So how do you interpret the Chinese, shall we say, long-term strategy? Two countries that may be in different stages of domestic disorder, yet China is invested in them. It's a member of the UN Security Council and is very righteous about the need to deal with terrorism.
See, I think the common factor is really the United States. In North Korea, all said and done, the regime is actually fairly stable, and it plays a very simple, straightforward role in putting the US and Chinese adversaries such as Japan on the back foot. Right? It's basically up to the Chinese how they can calibrate the relationship with the North Korean regime. In the case of Pakistan, matters are in a great deal of flux because of the involvement of non-state actors. And I think that's where the crux lies. The Chinese, despite what we think in India, the Chinese really don't get South Asia.
Don't get South Asia.
They don't get South Asia. So, it's an extremely complicated area, and so they are, by and large, forced to use the Pakistani medium to interpret goings on in the region. And that's where, their dependence on the ISI, on the Pakistani deep state, as it were, comes into play. What I think the Chinese have tried to do with the CPEC is try to break out of this paradigm. They want more stakeholders that they can tap within Pakistan. And I think that's the only explanation for what is ultimately a non-feasible economic corridor. I think, we have to give credit where it is due, that the Chinese are trying to be creative, trying to break out of a box that they find themselves in the case of Pakistan.
Okay, if I can just change gears and now look at the United States. Ambassador Raghavan, the US policy as far as South Asia and Pakistan is concerned, now one of the observations again that is often made is that the United States is committed to Pakistan for a variety of reasons. It is providing military aid, it's providing financial aid, and it is also dealing with the ignominy of Pakistan and the deep state and its many tentacles actually killing American soldiers with the treasure and the military equipment they have received. So that's a huge policy conundrum. You've been in Islamabad as the High Commissioner. What is your reading of US-Pakistan in relation to terror? And I'm going to come to you, Chris, after that.
Well, at a minimum, all countries want to have a relationship with Pakistan which has a large security element to it. Pakistan is 200 million people. It has large diasporas all over the world, especially in West Europe and North America. It has a geographical position where it has certain utilities to the Western alliance, but also certain consequences. So at a minimum, all these countries will try to see that they have a security relationship with Pakistan to get a certain amount of intelligence about what is happening in Pakistan itself, lest the absence of that intelligence becomes a security threat to them domestically. I think whether it is the United States or whether it is other countries in Europe, they will do a great deal to preserve that minimum relationship. And obviously, one way of preserving that relationship has been financial aid, defense aid, military aid, etc., etc. I think it's useful to keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that those countries don't share your assessments about what is happening in Pakistan, but they are also trying to guard their own self-interest while sharing those assessments with us.
Chris, if I can turn to you, we're running out of time, but US policy to Pakistan and terrorism, if you can Twitter your way through this 280 words.
So look, I will say the primordial mistake that the United States made in the post 9/11 world was invading Afghanistan, because our only partner to do that was Pakistan. And so we went to war with the one country that was actually committed to the obverse of outcomes. And so this has been sort of like a treadmill. And so we can't undo that mistake, but as our troop posture continued to expand in Afghanistan, and we needed more troops because we were losing because of Pakistan, the surge, for example, made us more dependent upon Pakistan. And so you had this enormous disconnect. We needed to cater to Pakistan, to placate Pakistan, to sustain a war that we were losing because of Pakistan. And now that we are in a position of not requiring Pakistan to sustain this footprint, and I'm hoping that as Iran is normalized back into the international community, we have other options to sustain the smaller footprint. I would have hoped that the Americans would have been able to recalibrate their relationship. But the irony is that the two things that we fear most, which is nuclear extortion, terrorists getting nuclear weapons, they've actually expanded their nuclear arsenal. They've gone and developed tactical nuclear weapons on our dime. And so now we're at a place, because of our relationship with Pakistan since 9/11, that they're actually more dangerous. And so when you talk to people on the Hill, policymakers are very risk averse to doing anything different. And going to the ambassador's point, they have this belief that as long as they keep writing the checks, not only do they have access to intelligence, but also influence. And my argument has been, what are the benefits of this influence? Because what we've seen are mostly negative.
So this is really, I think, the continuing appeasement of Pakistan, and maybe the US will recalibrate.
It's nuclear blackmail.
True, absolutely. But terrorism and its state-sponsored variant remains a tenacious challenge to the international community, more so when, as our discussion has shown, the state in question has nuclear weapons. The motivation and ideology that gives traction to the perpetrator and the response that follows the trauma of terror remain the critical determinants. While India has been dealing with this since the early 1990s, the anxiety about terrorism entered the global security discourse only after September 11, 2001 or 9/11. The United States has led the global war against terror, and 15 years later, the results are mixed. The major powers and the United Nations Security Council in particular have a special responsibility in this regard. While the domestic national security interest will remain the most important consideration for policymakers, the need for a collective approach that harmonizes the common good with the individual national compulsion cannot be ignored. How do we get there? That remains elusive as of now, but the effort to find that consensus must continue. On that note, let me thank my guests. Ambassador Raghavan,
Thank you.
Professor Christine Fair, Dr. Jabin Jacob. And thank you for watching Security Scan. Goodbye.